Have you ever stood before a photograph or a painting of an ancient Egyptian temple and felt like you were almost there? We see the towering columns, the intricate hieroglyphs, the play of light and shadow across weathered stone, but something crucial is missing. You can almost hear the whispers of priests, sense the presence of worshippers, even feel the desert heat, yet there's a whole dimension of that world that history books have long ignored. What did it actually smell like? For centuries, our understanding of ancient civilizations has been overwhelmingly visual. We study artifacts, architecture, and art, but we rarely stop to consider the scents that filled these sacred spaces, the very air people breathe during moments of prayer, celebration, and ritual. Think about it. Smell is one of the most powerful and immediate senses we have. It can evoke memory, trigger emotion, even alter our state of mind. So what was it like to walk into an Egyptian temple, not as a silent observer from the future, but as a living participant thousands of years ago? What aromas drifted through those hallowed halls? What sacred resins burned at the altars? What perfumes anointed the statues of gods and the skin of priestesses? Today, we're going to do more than just imagine. Using cutting-edge research from archaeology, chemistry, and even botany, we're about to reconstruct the lost olfactory landscape of ancient Egypt. We'll explore the ingredients of holy incense, uncover the meaning behind ritual fragrances, and breathe life into a world we thought was silent. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a sensory journey back in time. You're about to discover how temple spaces were deliberately designed to engage not just the eyes, but the nose, and how scent was believed to bridge the gap between the human and the divine. So let's step beyond the visuals and into the aromatic heart of ancient Egyptian spirituality. So how do we move from silent stone to the scent of sacred smoke? This isn't about wild guesses or poetic imagination. It's a meticulous scientific process, a form of historical detective work that pieces together evidence from multiple disciplines. The key lies in the residues left behind, the microscopic clues that have survived millennia. Researchers begin with residue analysis, carefully scraping the interiors of ancient pottery vessels, incense burners, and even the porous stone of altars themselves. These minuscule samples, often invisible to the naked eye, are treasure troves of chemical information. The real magic happens with analytical techniques like gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. This powerful tool allows scientists to separate and identify the individual chemical compounds within a sample. Think of it as taking a complex, ancient soup and isolating every single ingredient. A smear inside a clay jar might reveal traces of frankincense. A crust on a ritual spoon could yield the chemical fingerprint of myrrh. These aren't just assumptions, they are definitive identifications of the exact substances burned, poured, or offered thousands of years ago. But the science doesn't work in a vacuum. It's powerfully corroborated by the written word. The walls of temples and fragile papyri are filled with meticulous records, lists of offerings, recipes for sacred unguents, and detailed accounts of rituals. The Egyptians were superb bureaucrats, and they documented the quantities of precious materials required for ceremonies. A hieroglyphic text might specify that a certain rite demanded 10 deben of honey, 5 of juniper berries, and a jar of terebinth resin. When chemists find the residue of terebinth resin in a temple storage chamber, it powerfully confirms the written record, transforming a recipe into a reality. This multi-pronged approach, combining hard data from chemistry with the soft power of philology and archaeology, allows us to move beyond the realm of might have been into a much more confident was. We're not just saying a temple probably smelled fragrant. We can start to identify the specific, complex bouquet of aromas that define the spiritual experience, rebuilding an invisible world one molecule at a time. Now, with this scientific confirmation of the specific ingredients, we can turn to the places where those scents were actually experienced, the temples themselves. And here's where it gets truly fascinating, because the ancient Egyptians didn't just use these aromas. They engineered their entire sacred architecture to maximize their impact. The temple was far more than a beautiful stone backdrop. It was a carefully designed machine for the senses, particularly the sense of smell, Think of those towering stone gateways, the pylons, not just as impressive entrances, but as massive scent locks. As a worshiper passed through them, leaving the dusty, common air of the outside world behind, they were progressively sealed into a controlled environment. Inside, the design was a masterclass in olfactory manipulation. Those incredibly thick stone walls weren't just for grandeur or structural support. They acted as thermal masses, absorbing the heat of the day. This created a stable, often cooler interior climate that helped to preserve and slowly release the complex fragrance molecules from resins and oils. The enclosed, windowless nature of the inner sanctuaries, the Holy of Holies, wasn't just about creating darkness and mystery, it was about concentrating scent. In these small, sealed rooms, where only the high priest might enter, the smoke from the altar would have nowhere to dissipate. It would hang in the air, thick and potent, a palpable, suffocating cloud of divinity that would cling to skin, hair, and clothing. But it wasn't just about trapping smells, it was also about directing them. Evidence suggests that architects employed clever ventilation systems, not to clear the air, but to guide it. Small, strategically placed openings or shafts might have been designed to create gentle air currents, pulling the fragrant smoke from the main altar through specific halls or past certain statues, ensuring that the sacred aroma permeated the entire ritual pathway. This created a gradient of scent, growing more and more intense as one moved from the open courtyards toward the inner sanctuary. The experience was deliberately overwhelming. A worshiper wouldn't just see the god's statue in a haze of smoke. They would breathe the god's very essence. The boundary between the physical air and the spiritual presence would blur completely, achieved not by accident, but by brilliant, intentional architectural design. The temple itself became an instrument, and scent was its most powerful note. With the stage so carefully set by the temple's architecture, the true star of this sensory performance was the incense itself. And among all the sacred aromas, one mixture reigned supreme, a legendary fragrance so potent and revered it was considered the very breath of the gods, kyphi. This was not a simple, single-ingredient resin. It was the ancient world's most sophisticated perfumery, a complex symphony of scents meticulously blended into a single, divine offering. Imagine a recipe passed down through generations of priests, a sacred formulary so precious it was often recorded on temple walls to preserve its magic for eternity. The creation of kyphi was a ritual in itself, a slow, meditative process that could take many days to complete. Ancient texts describe it as a kind of alchemy, beginning with the base notes of raisins and sweet wine, which were mashed together and left to ferment, creating a rich, fruity foundation. To this, honey was added, not just for sweetness, but for its symbolic property of attracting divine favor. Then came the resins, chunks of fragrant myrrh and frankincense, which would have provided a deep, balsamic, and slightly smoky heart to the entire mixture. But the recipe delved much deeper into the natural world. Modern research, cross-referencing ancient texts like the inscription at the Edfu temple with residue analysis, suggests a stunning list of up to 16 ingredients. This could include the warming spice of cinnamon, the citrusy aroma of juniper berries, the earthy depth of camel grass, the pine-like scent of terebinth tree resin, and even the aromatic roots of the sweet flag plant. Each step of its preparation was as important as the ingredients themselves. Priests would grind, pound, and mix these components at specific times of day, often reciting spells or hymns to imbue the physical substance with spiritual power. The mixture was then rolled into small balls or cakes and left to dry, slowly maturing and allowing all the complex aromas to meld into one harmonious whole. When it was finally time for its use, a ball of kyphi would be placed on a hot charcoal brazier. It wouldn't burst into a quick, smoky flame. Instead, it would smolder slowly, releasing its fragrance in a continuous, thick plume. This wasn't a sharp or acrid smoke, but a warm, enveloping, and incredibly complex aroma. You would have first smelled the sweet, almost caramel-like notes from the honey and wine, followed by the warm, spicy undertones of cinnamon and juniper, all grounded by the profound, sacred depth of frankincense and myrrh. This was the ultimate offering, the scent meant to please the gods above all others. It was believed that the aroma of kyphi not only attracted divine attention, but also induced a state of tranquility and even prophetic dreams in those who inhaled it. As it smoldered in the inner sanctum, its smoke would have filled the architecturally perfected chamber, clinging to the statue of the god and the robes of the high priest, making the divine presence literally tangible in the air. To breathe in kyphi, I was to breathe in the essence of the cosmos itself, a fragrant bridge between earth and heaven that turned the very atmosphere of the temple into something holy. While kyphi represented the pinnacle of ritual blending, two ingredients were so fundamental, so potent in their own right, that they often dwarfed all others in both quantity and symbolic power. These were the legendary resins of frankincense and myrrh, substances so valuable they were literally worth their weight in gold. To truly understand the atmosphere of an Egyptian temple, you must first grasp the sheer scale of their use. This wasn't a matter of a few precious grains being carefully sprinkled onto a brazier. Temples operated on an industrial scale. Records from the great Temple of Amun at Thebes detail annual imports amounting to thousands of pounds of these resins. They were burned in massive censers by the bucketful, creating a constant, smoldering haze that would have been the dominant scent from the outer courts all the way to the inner sanctum. The reason for this extravagant consumption was rooted in their profound symbolism. Both resins were exotic imports, arriving via long and perilous trade routes from the distant land of Punt, a place shrouded in mystery, believed by the Egyptians to be near the coast of modern-day Somalia or Yemen. The very difficulty of acquiring them, the immense cost of their transportation by caravan and ship, meant they were automatically associated with immense prestige and divinity. They were not local products, they were gifts from a far-off, almost mythical land, making them fitting offerings for the gods. When burned, their smoke did not simply smell pleasant. It was seen as the visible breath of the divine, a medium that could carry prayers upward to the heavens and simultaneously make a god's presence manifest on earth. The act of offering these resins was so potent that it was believed to sustain the gods themselves, maintaining the cosmic order, or ma'at. For a pharaoh, the use of frankincense and myrrh was a direct assertion of his own divine right to rule, connecting his kingship to the eternal and the sacred. But beyond the symbolism and the staggering economics, there was the raw, sensory experience of their aroma. While often mentioned together, frankincense and myrrh produce distinctly different, though complementary, scents. Frankincense, harvested from the boswellia tree, offers a brighter, cleaner fragrance. When its pale golden tears of resin hit the hot charcoal, they release a vibrant, uplifting aroma. Think of a crisp, clean, pine-like scent, but with luminous citrus top notes, something like a blend of lemon, pepper, and clean wood smoke. It's an airy, clarifying smell that seems to purify the atmosphere. Myrrh from the Commiphora tree is its deeper, more solemn counterpart. Its darker, reddish-brown resin produces a richer, heavier smoke. Its scent is warmer, more balsamic, and slightly medicinal, with deep, earthy, and almost sweet undertones that have been compared to licorice or vintage port wine. It feels ancient, serious, and grounding. Imagine, then, the combined effect within the temple walls. The air wouldn't have held just one of these scents, but a layered, ever-shifting tapestry of both. The brighter, purifying smoke of frankincense would have likely been more prevalent in the outer areas, used to cleanse both the space and the worshippers entering it. As one moved inward, the deeper, more contemplative aroma of myrrh would have grown stronger, blending with the frankincense to create a complex, sacred perfume that was both invigorating and meditative. This wasn't a subtle background note, it was an overwhelming, constant presence. The smoke would have stung the eyes slightly, coated the tongue, and clung to every surface. To walk through an Egyptian temple during a major festival was to be immersed in a thick, fragrant cloud of these kingly resins, a physical manifestation of both immense earthly power and profound spiritual devotion, an aroma so expensive it was literally fit for a god. This deep connection between deity and fragrance extended far beyond the general ambience of the temple. It was woven into the very identity of the gods and goddesses themselves. Just as a king might be recognized by his crown or a soldier by his uniform, an Egyptian deity could be identified by their unique and characteristic scent. This wasn't a vague, poetic notion. It was a concrete theological concept preserved in hymns, prayers, and ritual texts. The air around a god was believed to be perfumed, and specific aromas were as much part of their divine essence as their animal-headed forms or their symbolic regalia. To encounter the scent was, in a very real way, to encounter the god. Take the great state god Amun, for instance, the hidden one, the king of the gods whose presence was felt everywhere yet seen by none. His primary scent was frankincense. This makes perfect sense when you consider its properties. Frankincense smoke rises in a clean, straight column, disappearing into the heavens. Its bright, purifying, and luminous aroma symbolized his role as a supreme, celestial creator god, a deity of air and breath whose presence cleansed and elevated the spirit. To smell the crisp, citrusy smoke of frankincense was to know that Amun was near. In beautiful contrast, the goddess Hathor, the embodiment of love, beauty, music, and drunken ecstasy, was intimately associated with the scent of myrrh. Its deep, rich, sensual, and almost intoxicating aroma perfectly captured her dual nature as both a nurturing mother and a dangerous seductress. Myrrh's warm, balsamic, and slightly sweet scent was linked to femininity, allure, and even the afterlife, where she would welcome the deceased. In one of her most famous myths, the Contendings of Horus and Seth, she uses her powerful sexuality to cheer up her father Ra, an act of divine therapy that aligns perfectly with myrrh's comforting and grounding properties. Then, there was the sun god Ra, the most powerful force in the cosmos. His divine fragrance was that of the lotus flower. This association is profoundly beautiful and symbolic. The blue lotus, or Nymphea caerulea, does not merely smell pleasant, it performs a daily miracle. Each morning, as the sun rises, the lotus blossom emerges from the murky waters and opens its petals to the sky, releasing a sweet, intense, and hypnotic fragrance. Then, as the sun sets, it closes its petals and sinks beneath the water once more, only to repeat the cycle the next day. For the Egyptians, the lotus wasn't just a flower, it was a perfect mirror of Ra's own daily journey, birth, death, and rebirth in an eternal cycle. The scent of the lotus was the very breath of the rising sun, the aroma of creation itself being renewed each and every dawn. To inhale it was to participate in this daily victory of light over darkness. This practice of assigning divine scents created a powerful and immediate form of recognition for worshippers. A priest anointing a statue of Hathor with myrrh oil wasn't just maintaining a relic, he was activating her presence, making her tangible through her signature fragrance. When a temple festival for Ra commenced at sunrise, with lotus blossoms handed out to the crowd, the air would become thick with his sacred perfume, assuring everyone that the sun god was truly among them. This olfactory identity transformed the act of worship from a purely visual or intellectual exercise into a full-bodied, immersive experience. You didn't just see a statue, you breathed the god. The association was so strong that a smell of particular fragrance in an unexpected place might be interpreted as a sign or an omen, a momentary and mysterious visitation from the divine. The gods had a smell, and for the ancient Egyptians, that smell was proof, of course. The most vital application of these divine scents happened not during grand public festivals, but in the deep, quiet solitude of the temple's inner sanctum each and every morning. This was the ceremony of the awakening of the god, a daily ritual so fundamental that it was considered the very engine of the cosmos. Before the first ray of sun touched the temple's pylon gates, while the world outside was still shrouded in the cool, pre-dawn darkness, the high priest would already be preparing for his most sacred duty. His goal was nothing less than to rouse the deity from its nightly slumber and restore Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order and balance, for another day. The ritual was a precise and deeply symbolic sequence of actions. The priest, having undergone rigorous purification bathing, shaving his entire body, and wearing only pristine white linen, would approach the sealed doors of the naos, the shrine containing the god's statue. He would break the clay seal affixed the previous evening, a powerful act that marked the transition from one day to the next. As the doors were opened, he would be the first human to lay eyes upon the god since it had been put to bed the night before. But his first communication with the divine was not through words or sight, it was through scent. The first act was to offer the god's eyes, anointing the statue's face with fragrant oils, symbolically restoring its senses. But then came the central olfactory moment, the lighting of the incense burner. A small cake of kyphi, or a nugget of pure frankincense, would be placed on the hot charcoal. In the profound silence of the sealed chamber, the only sounds would be the soft crackle of the resin and the priest's own breathing. As the smoke began to coil upward, he would recite ancient hymns, his voice perhaps barely a whisper in the fragrant haze. The words of one such hymn, preserved from the temple of Horus at Edfu, beautifully captures the intent. Awake in peace, great God, may frankincense purify you, may incense make you divine. This was far more than just a pleasant way to start the day. The rising column of fragrant smoke was a direct parallel to the first ray of sunlight, which at that very moment would be piercing the horizon. Just as the sun god Ra was reborn each dawn from the darkness, the statue, the god's earthly vessel, was being reborn through this ritual of scent and sound. The fresh, purifying aroma of the incense was believed to literally revive the deity's spirit within the statue, animating it, making it once again a viable conduit for divine power. The scent drove away the chaotic forces of Isfet darkness, stagnation, and disorder that had gathered during the night, re-establishing Mat for another 24-hour cycle. To breathe in that first, concentrated cloud of sacred smoke was to inhale the very moment of creation, a daily renaissance made tangible through aroma. For the priest performing this duty, it was the pinnacle of his life's work, a private, overwhelming sensory experience that connected him directly to the heartbeat of the universe itself. Yet if the daily ritual was a carefully measured whisper of scent, the great state festivals were a roaring, aromatic explosion that engulfed the entire community. Consider the sheer spectacle of the Opet festival in Thebes, an event that could last nearly a full month. This was not a private ceremony confined to the temple's inner chambers. It was a massive public procession where the statues of the gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were carried from the dark sanctum of Karnak Temple on elaborate golden barks, journeying down the Avenue of Sphinxes to visit the Luxor Temple. This was the divine family taking a very public vacation, and the entire city turned out to witness it and to smell it. The scale of olfactory offerings during these events is almost unimaginable to us today. The normal, already substantial daily incense ration was multiplied 100-fold. Temple records speak of staggering allocations, hundreds of pounds of frankincense and myrrh, vats of kyphi, and vast quantities of other precious resins and oils designated for festival use alone. Dozens, if not hundreds, of priests and temple attendants would have been stationed along the procession route, swinging massive censers. Imagine not one small brazier, but great metal bowls the size of cartwheels, heaped with glowing charcoal and overflowing with chunks of resin carried on long poles by two men. As they walked, they would rhythmically swing these censers, sending vast plumes of fragrant smoke billowing out over the crowds. The effect would have been utterly transformative. The normally clear desert air along the Nile would have grown thick and hazy, a visible, perfumed fog that settled over the entire city district. The smoke would have poured from the temple gates, trailed the divine barks like a celestial wake, and seeped into the very walls of the houses lining the route. For those watching the procession, the experience was a full-body immersion. The scent would have coated their skin and clothes, clung to their hair, and flavored the food and drink they consumed during the celebrations. This was no longer just an offering to the gods. It was a communal sacrament, a way for every single person, from the highest official to the lowest laborer, to literally breathe in the divine presence. They weren't just spectators, they were participants in an aromatic bath that united the entire city in a shared sensory experience of the sacred. This overwhelming cloud of scent served a profound theological purpose beyond mere spectacle. In Egyptian belief, the barrier between the human world and the divine realm was not a fixed wall, but a permeable veil. During these great festivals, that veil was meant to be lifted, and scent was the primary tool for doing so. The massive, concentrated output of incense was believed to create a literal, physical atmosphere of divinity, an environment so saturated with sacred aroma that the gods could not help but be drawn down into it and remain present among their people. The smoke formed a bridge, a fragrant pathway that guided the deities from their celestial abode into their statues and among the cheering crowds. The olfactory assault was also a powerful display of state power and economic might. Everyone in that crowd knew that the frankincense and myrrh burning by the pound in front of them were worth a fortune, imported from unimaginably distant lands at tremendous cost. The pharaoh, as the chief priest and patron of the festival, was demonstrating his unique ability to command such wealth and channel it towards pleasing the gods. The message was clear: his reign was so prosperous and his connection to the divine so strong that he could literally set a king's ransom on fire for public benefit. The smell of abundance was, in itself, a political statement, a sensory affirmation of the kingdom's stability and the pharaoh's rightful place as the intermediary between the people and the pantheon. To breathe in that expensive, holy smoke was to inhale a promise of continued order and prosperity, a communal blessing that was as much about earthly power as it was about heavenly connection. Yet for all the grandeur of imported resins and complex kyphi blends, there was another fundamental layer to the temple's aroma, a foundational note woven into the very fabric of daily life along the Nile. This was the ever-present, grounding scent of the river itself. While the priests burned precious incense to create a heavenly atmosphere, the natural world provided its own profound contribution to the sacred olfactory palette. The great temples of Egypt weren't built in isolation. They were almost always constructed on the river's banks, placing them at the vibrant intersection of the cultivated and the divine. This strategic location meant that the air circulating through their columned halls was never purely the product of human ritual. It was a complex and ever-changing blend, a dialogue between the sacred smoke offered to the gods and the life-giving breath of the Nile. Before a worshiper even caught the first distant whiff of temple incense, they would have been enveloped by the natural aromas of the riverine environment. The air carried the distinct, clean scent of water flowing through vast, sun-baked landscapes, a crisp, slightly mineral quality that stands in sharp contrast to the stagnant smell of a still pond. Intermingled with this was the rich, profound smell of damp, black earth. This wasn't just any soil. This was the kemet, the black land, the incredibly fertile silt deposited by the Nile's annual inundation. This earth had a deep, almost sweet, organic fragrance, the smell of life and potential, of seeds germinating and crops thriving. It was the literal scent of Egypt's abundance. On the temple grounds, particularly in the sacred lakes and ornamental ponds that were a feature of many temple complexes, these base notes would be accentuated by the fragrance of aquatic plants. Blue lotus blossoms, as we've discussed, released their sweet, intense perfume, but so did papyrus reeds, which when crushed or warmed by the sun, give off a fresh, green, slightly grassy aroma. This combination created a constant, low-level olfactory hum of water, fertile mud, and blooming flora, the very essence of the Nile's generative power. The true magic happened when these two worlds collided. The ritual smoke from the inner sanctuaries didn't just vanish into a neutral void. It poured out into this humid, scent-rich atmosphere. The heavy, resinous clouds of frankincense and myrrh would mix with the damp river air, fundamentally altering their character. In the dry, desert heat, incense smoke can become sharp and acrid, but the humidity of the Nile Valley would have softened and rounded those edges. The moisture in the air would act almost like a natural diffuser, causing the smoke particles to swell and blend, creating a thicker, richer, and more lingering fragrance. A plume of frankincense smoke that might have been bright and citrusy in a dry climate would, in this environment, take on a deeper, almost creamy quality. The earthy base notes from the river mud would blend with the balsamic depth of myrrh, creating an even more complex and grounding sensation underfoot. This unique alchemy of climate and ritual produced an olfactory profile that was distinctly Egyptian, one that could not be replicated in a desert oracle or a mountain shrine. It was a scent born from the meeting of earth and heaven, the natural and the supernatural. This blending was likely more than just a happy accident. It was probably deeply embedded in the Egyptian worldview. The Nile's inundation was the central, life-giving event of the year, and its associated smells of renewing water and fertile silt were the smells of survival, prosperity, and cosmic order. By building their temples in this environment and allowing these natural aromas to intermingle with the sacred smoke, the priests were effectively weaving the divine ritual into the very fabric of the natural world they depended upon. The scent of the god was not separate from the scent of the land. They were one and the same. To breathe in the temple air was to inhale a complete sensory picture of Egypt itself, the gift of the Nile, the power of the pharaoh, and the presence of the gods, all united in a single, unforgettable, and uniquely Egyptian breath. Walking through an Egyptian temple, your nose wouldn't just be met with the distant, holy smoke from the inner sanctum. It would be greeted by an immediate, vibrant explosion of living flowers. The visual splendor of painted reliefs showing gods holding blooms was mirrored in reality by a staggering abundance of fresh floral offerings. Temples were not just stone structures. They were vast, fragrant gardens brought indoors, with heaps of blossoms transforming cold stone into a living, breathing extension of the Nile's most beautiful bounty. Foremost among these sacred botanicals was the blue lotus, a flower so deeply revered it was practically a divine entity in its own right. This wasn't merely a decorative touch. Its role was profound and multi-sensory. The blue lotus, or Nymphea caerulea, possesses a unique and powerful property. As the morning sun warms its petals, the flower releases an intense, sweet, and almost hypnotic fragrance. But this scent was more than just pleasant. It was believed to have mild psychoactive, narcotic qualities. When added to wine or simply inhaled in large quantities, the fragrance could induce a state of relaxed euphoria and heightened awareness. For the Egyptians, this wasn't intoxication, it was enlightenment. It was a physiological key that could open a door to the divine, allowing a worshiper or priest to achieve an altered state closer to that of the gods. To breathe in the lotus's perfume was to participate in a form of sacred communion, a sensory ritual that blurred the lines between the earthly and the spiritual. But the lotus didn't work alone. Its serene, aquatic beauty was complemented by the towering presence of the white Madonna lily, Lilium candidum. While the lotus symbolized the sun and rebirth, the tall, stately lily, with its blindingly white petals and heavy, intoxicating perfume, represented purity, regality, and a different kind of potent offering. These lilies were not arranged in delicate vases. They were gathered by the armful and piled in massive, lavish quantities around the bases of altars and divine statues. Temple inscriptions detailed the sheer volume required for major festivals, thousands of stems, their stems bundled together, creating great, fragrant mounds of white. The goal was opulence, an overwhelming visual and olfactory declaration of devotion. The air in these spaces would have been thick with the lily's potent, sweet, and almost spicy perfume, a scent so strong it would have mingled with and sometimes even momentarily overpowered the smokier notes of incense. This practice created a complex, layered olfactory experience. Imagine stepping into a temple hall. Your first impression is the heady, narcotic sweetness of thousands of lotus blossoms floating in sacred basins and strewn across floors. This is undercut by the crisp, clean, and profoundly regal aroma of the lilies piled high around you. And weaving through it all, the constant, smoldering bass note of kyphi or frankincense smoke from the inner chambers. This wasn't a random assortment of nice smells. It was a deliberate olfactory symphony. Each fragrance played a specific role: the lotus to alter consciousness and connect to the gods of creation, the lily to symbolize purity and lavish honor, and the incense to carry prayers and manifest divine presence. Together, they saturated the temple atmosphere, ensuring that every breath taken within those sacred walls was a direct, immersive, and unforgettable participation in the divine. Yet for all the divine perfumes of flowers and incense, the temple's air held another, far more visceral layer of reality. The ancient Egyptian world was one of stark balance, and their rituals reflected this duality. The sublime always existed alongside the elemental. During the most significant offering ceremonies, the sweet, heavenly clouds of kyphi and frankincense would have intermingled with the potent, earthy, and unmistakable smells of animal sacrifice. This was not a hidden or shameful act, but a fundamental and celebrated part of maintaining the cosmic order, and its olfactory signature was as powerful as any sacred resin. The scale of this practice was immense. Temple reliefs and administrative papyri record the staggering numbers of cattle, geese, and goats presented to the gods. A single festival could see the offering of hundreds, even thousands, of animals. The outer courtyards of major temples would have functioned much like a bustling, open-air butcher's yard prior to a great ceremony. The air here would have been thick with a complex and challenging bouquet. First, the metallic, coppery scent of fresh blood from the initial slaughter, a smell that is sharp, dense, and immediate. Then, the deeper, organic smell of raw meat and viscera, a rich, slightly sweet and gamey odor that speaks of life recently extinguished. There would have been the smell of animal fear and waste, the straw used to contain the chaos, and the sweat of the priests and workers conducting the ritualized slaughter with practiced efficiency. But the most significant transformation, and the most dominant of these sacrificial smells, came from the next step, the burning of the offering. The choice cuts of meat, typically the foreleg and the heart, symbols of power and life, were not simply laid before the god's statue. They were cooked. They were placed on altars over open fires or on hot braziers, their fat sizzling and dripping onto the coals below. This process released a completely different set of aromas. The sharp scent of blood was replaced by the universally familiar, primal smell of roasting meat. This is a smell that triggers deep-seated human responses, the savory, mouth-watering aroma of seared protein and rendered fat. Alongside it was the sharper, more acrid note of burning animal fat hitting hot stone or charcoal, a smell both rich and slightly pungent. The theological purpose of this was profound. The Egyptians believed the gods themselves actually consumed the essence, the ka, of the offered food. The rising smoke from the roasting meat was the vehicle for this spiritual sustenance, just as incense smoke carried prayers. The smell of a perfectly roasted bull's haunch was therefore as much an offering as the smoke of frankincense. It was the aroma of a feast prepared for a deity. For the priests and the elite who might later consume the physical meat in a sacred meal, this created a powerful sensory link. They weren't just eating food, they were partaking in the same sustenance that had pleased the god, a communion made tangible through shared aroma and taste. The entire ritual, from the stark scent of death to the inviting smell of a prepared meal, represented the entire cycle of life and consumption, a cycle the gods were intimately a part of. The temple's atmosphere during these rites became a complete sensory representation of the Egyptian cosmos. The beautiful and the brutal, the transcendent and the terrestrial, all woven together into one overwhelming, sacred, and unforgettable experience. But the sacred scents weren't confined to altars and statues. They were embodied by the priests themselves, who transformed their own bodies into living, breathing instruments of the divine atmosphere. This practice went far beyond simple personal hygiene. It was a profound act of ritual purification and identification. Before a priest could even approach the inner sanctum, he underwent an extensive cleansing ceremony that was as much about olfactory transformation as it was about physical cleanliness. He would bathe in the temple's sacred lake, scrubbing his skin not with scented soaps as we know them, but with a paste made from natron salt, a naturally occurring mineral blend that left the skin feeling utterly clean and slightly abrasive, a perfect, odorless canvas for what came next. The next step was an elaborate anointing ritual. The priest would carefully apply specially formulated temple perfumes to key points on his body, his head, his hands, the soles of his feet. These unguents were not the simple floral waters of everyday life. They were complex, oil-based perfumes, thick and resinous, designed to last for hours. Recipes, preserved in texts like the Ebers papyrus, reveal these sacred blends were incredibly sophisticated. A typical temple perfume might combine the warmth of cinnamon, the spiciness of cardamom, the citrusy note of lemongrass or cypress grass, all bound together in a base of expensive moringa or Bolanos oil, and always the sacred base notes of myrrh and frankincense resin. The result was a rich, potent, and long-lasting fragrance that was completely unique to the temple environment. By anointing himself with these exact same aromatics that were burning on the altar and gracing the god's statue, the priest was performing a powerful act of sympathetic magic. He was making his own physical form smell like the divine. As he moved through the spaces of the temple, he didn't just carry the scent with him, he became a mobile source of it. In the dim, smoky halls, a worshiper might not clearly see the priest's face, but they would smell his approach, the familiar, holy fragrance of cinnamon and myrrh growing stronger, signaling the presence of a man who had been in the direct presence of the god. His very scent announced his role as an intermediary. He was no longer just a man. He was a walking, talking extension of the temple's sacred environment, his body having absorbed the same essence that filled the air and pleased the deities. This olfactory identity created an unbreakable sensory link between the priest, the ritual, and the divine, ensuring that the sacred atmosphere was maintained not just in the stationary objects within the temple, but in the very people who served at its heart. Beyond the bustling courtyards and smoky altars, deep within the temple's most secure and dimly lit corridors, lay the true heart of its olfactory power, the storage chambers. These were not mere closets or supply rooms. They were the temple's scent library, its aromatic armory, where the raw materials of divinity were meticulously cataloged and preserved. Imagine a vast, cool, and shadowy hall, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with row upon row of shelves, each one burdened with containers of every size and shape. The air in these silent, sacred vaults would have been staggeringly concentrated, a still and potent symphony of dormant fragrances waiting for their moment to be unleashed. The containers themselves were works of art, designed to protect their precious contents from the degrading effects of light and air. Alabaster jars, their white and translucent surfaces subtly veined, held the most expensive liquid unguents and perfumed oils. The cool, smooth stone was perfect for keeping precious oils at a stable temperature. For the prized solid resins, there were containers of faience, a glazed, ceramic-like material, as well as intricately carved wooden boxes and sacks made of the finest linen. Each vessel was often sealed with a clay stopper, sometimes even imprinted with the official seal denoting its contents, its weight, and its origin, a testament to the meticulous temple bureaucracy that tracked every ounce of its aromatic wealth. Stepping into one of these chambers would have been an overwhelming experience for the senses. Even before anything was opened, the very atmosphere was thick with the combined exhalation of thousands of botanical ingredients. The dry, woody, and slightly sweet scent of frankincense tears would have been the most prominent, a massive presence given the sheer volume stored, but it was far from alone. This base note would have been woven through with the sharper, medicinal, and deeply balsamic aroma of myrrh, the warm, spicy whisper of cinnamon sticks bundled together, the crisp, pine-like fragrance of juniper berries, and the sweet, hay-like scent of dried lotus petals and bundled herbs like camel grass. In the stillness, these scents didn't dissipate. They settled into layers, creating distinct aromatic zones within the chamber. A priest moving through the aisles would pass from a cloud dominated by the citrusy top notes of frankincense into a pocket of air rich with the earthy depth of myrrh, then into a section where the spicy warmth of cinnamon and cardamom took over. For the priests who managed this library, their role was that of a master perfumer and a librarian combined. They possessed a deep, practical knowledge of every substance in their care. They knew not just by sight, but by smell and touch, how to identify the highest grade of frankincense from Oman versus a lesser variety, or the exact viscosity that indicated a premium batch of moringa oil. Their daily tasks involved careful inspection, ensuring no precious material was spoiling or being compromised by pests. When the time came for a ritual, the head priest would present a requisition, a sacred shopping list based on ancient recipes. The storage priests would then move through their aromatic domain, gathering precise amounts from specific jars, a scoop of this resin, a measure of that dried herb, a carefully poured portion of this oil. This gathering was itself a preparatory ritual, a quiet and focused prelude to the fiery transformation that would occur at the altar. In these silent, fragrant vaults, one could literally hold the ingredients of heaven in the palm of one's hand, the very building blocks of the sacred atmosphere that defined ancient Egyptian worship. Now, let's follow our noses away from the smoky altars and the floral offerings to a part of the temple complex that would have smelled overwhelmingly, wonderfully familiar, the bakery. If the inner sanctum was the domain of otherworldly fragrances, the temple bakery was the heart of a homely, comforting aroma that formed the daily bread of both gods and mortals. These weren't small, domestic kitchens. They were massive, industrial-scale operations, churning out thousands of loaves of sacred bread every single day to meet the endless demand of the offering tables. The scale is almost impossible to overstate. At the Ramesseum, the mortuary temple of Ramesses II, archaeological evidence points to the existence of no fewer than 10 massive, permanent bakery installations, complete with rows of clay ovens and entire halls dedicated solely to grinding grain. Step into one of these areas, and the first sensation to hit you would have been the pervasive, fine dust of flour hanging in the air, a soft, earthy cloud that coated every surface and made the sunlight streaming into the workspace appear solid and tangible. This was accompanied by the constant, rhythmic, grinding sound of millstones, operated by teams of workers reducing huge quantities of myrrh wheat and barley into the coarse flour that was the foundation of Egyptian life. But beyond that, as you moved closer to the ovens, the true magic began. The air would grow warm and take on that most universal and comforting of smells, the scent of baking bread. This was not a single note, but a rich, complex bouquet. There was the toasty, nutty aroma of the emmer wheat itself, a heartier and more robust grain than modern wheat. Then, the sweet, caramel-like scent of honey, a divine substance often added to the dough for special offerings. And finally, the rich, fruity, deep sweetness of dates, which were sometimes mashed into a paste and used as a natural sweetener or even shaped into loaves themselves. This warm, enveloping fragrance was far more than just a pleasant side effect of food production. It was a central pillar of the temple's olfactory identity and its theological function. Each of these breads, shaped into symbolic forms like the semicircular pesin loaf or the conical Adolf loaf, was a direct offering to the god, just as the essence of the roasted meat and the incense smoke was consumed by the deity, so too was the ka, the life force of this bread. The act of baking was therefore a sacred act of transformation, turning the raw, earthy products of the Nile's fertility, grain, and honey, into a digestible form for a god. The smell of baking bread was, in its own way, as holy as the smell of frankincense. It was the aroma of divine sustenance being prepared, and the process didn't end with the offering. After the god had consumed its spiritual essence, the physical bread was distributed to the temple staff, the priests, scribes, bakers, and laborers, in a system known as the reversion of offerings. This meant that the daily meal of everyone who lived and worked within the temple walls was literally the bread of the gods, imbued with sanctity through its proximity to the divine. So when a priest sat down to eat his loaf, he was not just filling his stomach, he was partaking in a form of communion. The warm, sweet, comforting taste and smell of that bread was a tangible reminder of his place in a cosmic cycle of giving and receiving, a daily ritual that connected the most basic human need for nourishment directly to the altar of the god. The temple bakery, therefore, wove the sacred into the very fabric of daily life, ensuring that the most fundamental smell of home and hearth was also unmistakably the smell of heaven. Adjacent to the warm, flour-dusted air of the bakery, another workshop contributed its own deeply earthy and uniquely potent fragrance to the temple's olfactory tapestry, the brewery. This was no mere tavern, it was a sacred production facility, for the beer crafted within its walls was considered nothing less than the divine blood of Osiris, a potent life-giving fluid essential for both ritual and daily sustenance. The process of brewing, watched over by the goddess Hathor herself, the Lady of Drunkenness, filled the temple complex with a rich, complex, and unmistakable bouquet that stood in stark, beautiful contrast to the ethereal smoke of incense. The initial aroma in the brewery would have been one of simple, wholesome grain, the same nutty, toasted scent of emmer wheat and barley being ground for bread. But then came the magical transformation. The malted grain would be mixed with water and dates in large, wide-mouthed vats, and the natural yeasts present in the air and on the date skins would begin their work. This fermentation process would release a powerful, sweet, and slightly funky odor. Imagine the pungent, comforting smell of rising sourdough, but amplified and layered with the distinct, fruity sweetness of overripe dates. The air would be thick with the scent of active fermentation, a living, bubbling, slightly alcoholic cloud that announced the creation of something powerful and transformative. Once the mash was ready, it was strained through cloth-lined baskets into large ceramic jars, where it would continue to ferment. The final product was a thick, cloudy, nutrient-rich beverage, more like a hearty porridge or nutritional shake than the clear, carbonated beer we know today. Its signature scent was a robust combination of fermented grain, a tangy sourness from the wild yeast, and the rich caramel-like undertone from the dates. This was not a subtle aroma. It was a bold, vegetative, and profoundly earthy smell, the very scent of fertility and abundance made liquid. This humble, earthy fragrance held immense theological weight. Beer was a fundamental offering, presented in brilliant blue faience jars that mirrored the life-giving waters of the Nile. It was believed to restore the god's strength and vitality, with Osiris himself being revitalized by it in the underworld. During great festivals like the drunkenness of Hathor, the beer flowed freely for both deity and worshipper. The earthy, fermented scent of the brewery, therefore, mingled freely with the exotic imported perfumes of the procession, creating a uniquely Egyptian sensory paradox. The air was at once heavenly and profoundly terrestrial, a blend of the most expensive foreign resins and the most basic, life-sustaining local product. It was a fragrant reminder that the divine was not only found in the rare and the expensive, but also in the fermented grain that sprang from the black soil of Egypt itself, uniting the everyday reality of the people with the eternal power of their gods in every shared, intoxicating breath. Beneath the layered fragrances of ritual smoke, sweet flowers, and baking bread lay the most fundamental and constant scent of the temple itself, the quiet, grounding aroma of the very stone from which it was built. While we often think of stone as inert and odorless, on a hot Egyptian day, the vast expanses of limestone and granite that formed the walls, floors, and columns released a subtle but distinct mineral perfume into the air, a foundational note in the temple's complex olfactory symphony. This was especially true in the years following a pharaoh's great building project, where entire sections of the complex would have smelled strikingly of freshly quarried rock. The primary building material for most temples was limestone, a sedimentary rock relatively soft and easy to cut when first extracted from the earth. In the intense heat of the sun, a newly laid limestone block behaves almost like a living thing. As it warms, it releases a very specific, dry and chalky scent, a clean, slightly alkaline aroma that is reminiscent of wet pavement after a summer rain, but drier and more mineral. It's the smell of ancient seabeds, of crushed shells and fossilized life, a whisper of the distant geologic past. This scent would have been most potent in the quarry itself, a cloud of fine, white dust hanging in the air, clinging to the skin and hair of the thousands of workers and stonemasons. But it would have lingered on the newly finished temple walls as well, a constant, low-level emission that mixed with the desert air. For the inner sanctums and the most sacred elements like door lintels, thresholds, and the statues of the gods themselves, the Egyptians turned to the far harder and more impervious granite. Quarried from places like Aswan, this igneous rock has a completely different, much sharper olfactory character. When cut or ground by copper saws and abrasive sand, granite releases a distinct, almost metallic, flinty scent. It's a clean, spark-like aroma, reminiscent of striking two stones together and catching a brief electric whiff of ozone and earth. This smell of spark from the granite would have been a mark of the most sacred spaces, a crisp mineral counterpoint to the warmer, chalkier smell of the limestone halls leading to them. This mineral backdrop provided a crucial sensory anchor. The smell of stone was the smell of permanence, of eternity, of a monument built to last for millions of years. It was the one scent in the temple that never changed, never faded, and never required renewal. While the incense smoke would dissipate, the flowers would wilt, and the bread would be eaten, the cool mineral breath of the limestone and granite was a constant. For a priest walking from the sun-baked courtyard into the dim, cooler interior of the temple, that transition would have been marked not just by a drop in temperature and a dimming of light, but by a shift in smell. The complex outer air, rich with humanity, animals, and offerings, would give way to this simpler, cleaner, more ancient aroma, It was the olfactory equivalent of stepping out of the bustling, ephemeral world and into the silent, unchanging house of the god, a sensory reminder that you were now in a space built not for men, but for eternity. Before a priest could even approach a deity, before he could light the first brazier or anoint a single statue, he had to undergo a profound transformation not just of spirit, but of his very scent. This essential rite of passage happened in the temple's purification areas, spaces deliberately designed to be olfactory sanctuaries of absolute cleanliness, creating a stark sensory boundary between the profane outer world and the sacred inner one. Upon entering these chambers, the overwhelming complexity of the temple's aroma would have momentarily fallen away, replaced by a singular, dominant, and almost antiseptic smell, the clean, alkaline scent of natron salt. This was no ordinary washing up. Natron, a naturally occurring mixture of sodium carbonate decahydrate and sodium bicarbonate, harvested from the dried beds of desert lakes like Wadi el-Natron, was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a spiritual and physical disinfectant. Its use was deeply symbolic. It was the very substance the gods used to purify themselves, and it was also the primary agent used in mummification to dry and preserve the body for eternity. For a living priest, its application was the first and most critical step in shedding his mortal human odor to become a vessel fit for divine presence. The process was ritualized and thorough. The priest would mix the coarse, white natron crystals with water from the sacred lake to create an abrasive paste, or would simply rub the dry salt directly onto his dampened skin. The olfactory experience in these chambers would have been a world apart from the warm, resinous, and floral notes of the inner temple. The dominant scent was a sharp, clean, and slightly bitter alkaline aroma, reminiscent of a powerful baking soda or washing soda utterly devoid of any organic sweetness or perfume. It's a smell that feels purifying just to inhale, clean, dry, and slightly astringent. It would have seemed to scrub the very air itself. This created a powerful sensory transition. A priest, having just walked through courtyards smelling of baking bread, fermenting beer, and the dusty heat of the public spaces, would step into this zone of stark, mineral cleanliness. The act of scrubbing with natron would have erased all those previous smells from his skin, replacing them with this neutral, odorless canvas. He was not being made to smell good, he was being made to smell of nothing. His own human scent, the sweat of the day, the lingering odor of his last meal, any trace of the outside world was meticulously scoured away. This was the ultimate preparation. By eliminating his own scent, the priest was making himself a neutral conductor for the sacred aromas to come. He would not contaminate the divine fragrance of kyphi with his own humanity. Instead, he would leave the purification chamber as a blank slate, ready to be anointed with the temple's holy oils and perfumes, and finally, to be enveloped by the sacred smoke in the sanctuary. His body would absorb those divine smells completely, unadulterated by any competing odor. The purification area, with its dominant scent of clean natron, was therefore the essential prelude to every ritual, the sensory airlock that allowed a mere human to step, quite literally, into the fragrance of the gods. But the true mastery of the temple's perfumers was revealed in the creation of specific, named ritual oils, each with a distinct purpose and a fragrance profile to match. These weren't generic anointing fluids, they were precisely formulated tools for spiritual interaction. The most celebrated of all was the festival oil of joy, known as Hathor. This was the olfactory signature of national celebration, a perfume designed to elevate the spirit and manifest pure, divine delight. Its recipe was a symphony of exhilaration. The bright, uplifting zest of imported galbanum resin provided a sharp, green, almost pine-like top note, which was then blended with the sweet, sun-warmed aroma of mastic tears and the rich, honeyed depth of high-quality moringa oil. To anoint a worshipper with Hathor during the Apit festival was to mark them with the very scent of celebration, a fragrant signal that they were participating in a moment of divinely sanctioned joy and communal ecstasy. In direct contrast stood the oil of protection, known as sephek. Its purpose was not to celebrate, but to shield, to create an invisible, fragrant barrier against chaotic forces. Its aroma was accordingly darker, more serious, and intensely resinous. The base would have been the deeply balsamic, slightly medicinal scent of myrrh, renowned for its purifying properties. To this, priests would add the sharp, smoky note of frankincense and the pungent, protective aroma of garlic or onion juice, ingredients believed to ward off evil spirits and malevolent magic. The resulting fragrance was a potent, serious shield. When a priest anointed the doorways of the inner sanctuary or the brow of the pharaoh with sephic, he wasn't just applying a pleasant scent, he was activating a spiritual defense system, the smell of which alone was believed to make malevolent entities recoil. This practice of olfactory coating extended to the most intimate of rituals, the preparation for the afterlife. The legendary 7 sacred oils, found in tomb equipment from the earliest dynasties, were a complete aromatic kit for the soul's journey. Each oil had a name, a specific god associated with it, and a unique role. There was Hekanu for joy, certainly, but also Nekhenem for praise, with its bright, citrusy overtones. Tua, the oil of protection, likely shared Sephic's serious, resinous character. Hatent, perhaps the most intriguing, was the oil of gladness, a fragrance so potent it was believed to restore the deceased's ability to experience pleasure in the next world. We can imagine it as a lush, floral blend, heavy with the extracts of lotus and lily, designed to awaken the senses for eternity. To be anointed with these oils after death was to be equipped with a full sensory lexicon for the afterlife, each fragrance a key to navigating the divine tribunal or enjoying the pleasures of the field of reeds. The temple's perfumers were therefore not just artisans but spiritual cartographers, mapping the journey of the soul with scent. Just as Egypt itself was a land of stark contrasts, the fertile black land of the Nile Valley and the arid red land of the desert, the sacred scentscapes of its temples were not a single, uniform experience. A worshipper traveling from the marshy expanses of the delta to the sun-scorched cliffs of Upper Egypt would have encountered a dramatically shifting olfactory world, each temple's atmosphere uniquely shaped by its local environment, resources, and even the specific gods it housed. The very air one breathed was a direct reflection of the surrounding landscape and the distinct theological currents that flowed through each region. Imagine journeying north to the great Temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta. Here, the air would have been profoundly influenced by its watery, low-lying environment. The prevailing winds carried the damp, fresh scent of the Mediterranean Sea, mingled with the rich, organic aroma of the papyrus marshes and the fertile, almost sweet smell of black silt from the Nile's many branches. This natural aquatic base note would have deeply infused the temple's ritual aromas. The primary offering here might have been the sacred blue lotus, which grew in abundance in the delta's still waters. Its sweet, narcotic perfume would have been overwhelming, far more so than in a desert temple where every blossom had to be transported over long distances. The incense burned at Sais might have included a higher proportion of lighter, cleaner resins like frankincense, whose bright, citrusy smoke would have cut through the humid air, perhaps even blended with local ingredients like the dried rhizomes of sweet flag, a marsh plant with a spicy, earthy aroma. The overall sensation would have been one of lush, waterborne fertility, a cool, humid, and deeply vegetal sacred space that mirrored the generative power of the delta itself. Now, travel south to a temple carved directly into the cliffs of the desert's edge, like the magnificent structure built by Queen Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari. Here, the environment was the complete opposite. The air was hot, dry, and thin, carrying the sharp, mineral scent of sun-baked limestone and the subtle, spicy aroma of desert herbs of thyme, camel grass, and acacia that clung to life in the wadis. In this arid environment, the behavior of sacred smoke was entirely different. Incense resins like frankincense and myrrh would have burned hotter and faster, their smoke rising in quick, straight columns without the humid delta air to slow and thicken it. Their aromas would have been sharper, more concentrated, and perhaps even slightly acrid. The temple's perfumers would have likely favored richer, heavier, and more resinous blends to counteract the dryness, creating deeper, longer-lasting fragrances. The famed kyphi blend, with its honey and dried fruit base, would have smoldered perfectly here, its complex notes unfolding slowly in the parched air. The overall olfactory experience at a desert edge temple would have been one of intense, focused power, a dry, spicy, and deeply resinous atmosphere that felt ancient, serious, and intimately connected to the barren, majestic landscape that symbolized eternity for the Egyptian. And then there was Thebes, the religious capital for much of Egypt's history, home to the immense Karnak and Luxor temple complexes. Theban temples operated on a scale unlike any other, and their scentscape reflected this overwhelming ritual intensity. This was the epicenter of state religion, where the cult of the king of the gods, Amun, demanded a constant, staggering output of the most expensive offerings. The air in Thebes would have been perpetually hazy, a permanent, low-lying cloud of sacred smoke from hundreds of censers operating simultaneously across the vast precinct. The sheer volume of imported resin, burned here thousands of pounds of frankincense and myrrh every year, would have created a dominant, nearly suffocating bass note of high-grade incense, a smell of almost unimaginable wealth and power. Beyond the smoke, Thebes was also the stage for the most elaborate state festivals, like the Apet festival. During these events, the normal olfactory output was multiplied 100-fold. The procession routes would have been lined with priests swinging massive censers, while the sacred lakes of the temples would be covered in floating lotus blossoms, their sweet scent blending with the savory smell of thousands of roasted oxen offered to the god. The Theban aroma was therefore a complex, overwhelming layering of the highest quality imported incense, the metallic scent of vast quantities of sacrificial blood, the comforting smell of baking bread from industrial-scale temple bakeries, and the euphoric perfume of countless flowers. It was the most potent, most expensive, and most intense sacred aroma in all of Egypt, a sensory testament to the political and theological might of the city and its god. To breathe the air in Thebes was to inhale the very essence of the Egyptian empire at its peak. The temple's sacred aroma was never a static, unchanging perfume. It was a living, breathing entity that shifted and transformed with the turning of the year, intimately tied to the great life-giving pulse of the Nile and the agricultural cycle it governed. The Egyptian calendar was divided into 3 seasons, and each one brought a profound shift in the olfactory landscape, altering not only what was offered, but how those offerings behaved in the air. The year began with Akhet, the season of the inundation, a time of profound transformation for the entire land, as the Nile overflowed its banks, submerging the fields and surrounding the temple precincts with vast, shallow lakes. The very quality of the air changed. The normally dry desert atmosphere became thick with moisture, heavy with the rich, profound scent of damp, fertile silt, and the mineral tang of rising water. This humidity acted as a powerful diffuser for the temple's incense. The resins, which in the dry heat might burn quickly with a sharp, clear smoke, now smoldered more slowly, their fragrant molecules swelling in the damp air. The smoke from frankincense became thicker, creamier, and more lingering, while the deeper notes of myrrh grew even richer and more balsamic, clinging to the stone walls and linen robes with a tenacity they lacked in drier months. The temple, surrounded by water, would have felt like a perfumed island, its sacred smoke blending with the primal smell of the nourishing flood, creating an atmosphere of potent generative power. Following the retreating waters came Perit, the season of emergence, when the black earth reappeared and was sown with seed. This was a time of organized, hopeful labor, and the temple's scent profile reflected this shift towards cultivation and growth. While the daily incense rituals continued unabated, new aromas began to weave their way into the sacred space from the temple's own agricultural estates and workshop. The outer courtyards would smell of freshly turned, damp earth, and the green, vegetative scent of sprouting barley and emmer wheat. The bakery and brewery operations would ramp up to a fever pitch, their comforting smells of baking bread and fermenting grain becoming a constant, hearty backdrop to the more ethereal incense. This was also the season for pressing the vast quantities of linseed and moringa oil required for lamps, unguents, and offerings. The air around the workshops would carry the distinct, warm, and nutty aroma of these oils being extracted, a smell of practical industry and abundance that spoke of the land's renewal. The overall olfactory experience during Perit was one of building potential, a harmonious blend of the constant, sacred smoke and the burgeoning, earthy smells of a nation coming back to life, a sensory promise of the harvest to come. The final season, Shemu, was the season of harvest, and it brought with it an explosion of sensory intensity. The arid heat returned, making the incense smoke once again rise in sharp, clear columns, but now it was layered with the incredibly sweet sun-warmed perfume of ripened fruit brought in from the orchards as offerings. Massive piles of dates, figs, and grapes would fill the offering halls, their lush, sugary fragrances mingling with the resins in a truly intoxicating blend. This was also the time for the grape harvest and the beginning of the winemaking process. The temple grounds would resonate with the sweet, slightly funky smell of crushed grapes fermenting in large ceramic vats, an aroma of celebration and intoxicating joy dedicated to gods like Hathor. The sheer abundance of the harvest meant that offerings were more lavish than at any other time of year. The smell of roasting meat from sacrificial animals was more frequent, and the floral offerings became truly extravagant. The air was a complex, layered symphony of smoky, sweet, savory, and fermented notes, a full-bodied olfactory celebration of the Nile's completed cycle of life, death, and rebirth, all contained within the temple's walls. For the vast majority of ancient Egyptians, the privilege of stepping beyond the towering pylon gates and into the temple's outer courtyard during a major festival was a rare and overwhelming lifetime event. This was not the pristine, silent environment of the inner sanctums. This was a vibrant, chaotic, and profoundly human space, and its atmosphere was a complex tapestry woven from the sacred and the mundane. The first sensation to strike an ordinary farmer or craftsperson would not have been a single pure note of incense, but a powerful wall of smell, a living, breathing entity that was equal parts divine offering and bustling festival crowd. From the deeper, restricted parts of the temple, the distant but persistent sacred aromas would have drifted outwards, carried on thermal currents rising from the sun-warmed stone. A worshipper would catch the distinct, sweetly resinous bass note of frankincense and myrrh, a scent they knew was meant for the gods, but here, in the public space, that holy smoke mingled with the thick, greasy aroma of roasting meat from the hundreds of animal sacrifices offered that day. The savory, mouth-watering smell of sizzling fat hitting hot altars would have been incredibly potent, a constant olfactory reminder of the feast being prepared for the deity and later for the priest. Woven through this was the warm, comforting, and homely scent of sacred bread from the temple bakeries, thousands of loaves baking in mud brick ovens, their nutty, honey-sweetened aroma a stark contrast to the sharper sacrificial smells. But this divine bouquet was immediately grounded and often overpowered by the raw smells of the crowd itself. Packed into the sun-baked courtyard would be thousands of people, all having journeyed for the celebration. The air would be thick with the scent of humanity, the salty tang of sweat from bodies pressed together under the hot sun, blended with the simple, oily aroma of the cheap castor or linseed oil most people used to moisturize their skin against the dry climate. There was the smell of dusty, sun-bleached linen garments and the faint, earthy odor of straw from the sandals on their feet. Children would be eating dates and figs, their sticky, sugary scent adding a fleeting sweet note, while the constant movement of the crowd would have stirred up the ever-present fine dust of the Egyptian desert that coated every surface. Adding another potent layer to this olfactory symphony were the animals. Beyond those being ritually slaughtered, the festival grounds would have been filled with living creatures brought for sale, trade, or simply as transport. The sharp, ammoniac scent of goat and sheep dung would have been pervasive, along with the mustier, deeper smell of cattle. Donkeys, the primary beast of burden, would have added their own distinct, dry odor to the mix. Flies, attracted to the blood, the food, and the waste, would have been a constant presence, their buzzing a soundtrack to the olfactory assault. For a common Egyptian, this incredible, layered, and often contradictory blend of smells, the high, holy smoke of the gods mixing with the low, earthy scents of the people and their animals, was the smell of divinity. It was not a separate, rarefied experience. It was a full-bodied immersion into a world where the sacred and the profane existed side by side, each giving meaning and power to the other in one unforgettable, aromatic celebration. As the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the western cliffs and the sky deepened to a velvety indigo, the temple did not fall silent or still. It underwent a profound sensory transformation. The departure of Ra, the sun god, marked not an end to ritual, but the beginning of an entirely different liturgical cycle, one governed by the moon and stars and defined by a completely new olfactory palette. The night air itself was the first and most significant change. The blistering heat of the day, which had made incense smoke rise in quick, sharp columns, rapidly dissipated. As the massive limestone blocks of the temple walls released their stored warmth, the air within the complex grew noticeably cooler and denser. This shift in temperature and humidity fundamentally altered the behavior of scent. The fragrant smoke from the evening's offerings no longer raced upward toward the heavens. It now moved more slowly, lazily, coiling and pooling in the darkened halls like a visible, perfumed fog. The cooler, heavier air caused the aromatic molecules to linger close to the ground, creating a much more concentrated and intense sensory experience for the priests conducting the nocturnal rites. The ceremonies performed under the watchful eyes of the star goddess Nut were often more somber and mysterious than their daytime counterparts. This was the time for rituals connected to the perilous journey of the sun god through the underworld, a 12-hour odyssey of challenges and regeneration that mirrored the human hope for resurrection. To accompany and support Ra on this dangerous voyage, the priests turned to a different set of incenses, ones with deeper, more protective, and more contemplative properties. While frankincense, the scent of the celestial sun, was still used, it was often blended with larger proportions of its darker counterpart, myrrh. Myrrh's rich, balsamic, and slightly medicinal aroma was believed to have potent apotrope qualities, the power to ward off the chaotic demons and serpents that threaten the solar bark in the depths of the night. The smoke that filled the sanctuary after dark would have been heavier, sweeter, and more serious, a fragrant shield against the unseen dangers of the Jewat, the underworld. Adding a new, starkly elemental note to this nocturnal atmosphere was the widespread use of torches and oil lamps. With the sun gone, artificial light was a necessity, and each flame contributed its own distinct smell to the temple's night air. Reed torches dipped in animal fat or resin would have sputtered and crackled, releasing a sharp, smoky, slightly greasy odor that was entirely different from the clean, ritual smoke of the incense burners. The simple clay saucer lamps, burning with a steady flame fueled by linseed or castor oil, added their own warm, nutty, and slightly pungent aroma to the mix. This was not a clean, purified scentscape. It was a more primal, complex blend. The sacred myrrh smoke would intertwine with the sooty smell of burning torch fat and the earthy scent of lamp oil, creating a layered atmosphere that felt ancient, protective, and intimately connected to the struggle between light and darkness taking place both in the myth and in the very temple around them. The architecture, so masterfully designed to manipulate daytime scents, took on a new character after nightfall. The towering columns and high, darkened ceilings, invisible in the gloom beyond the reach of the flickering torchlight, seemed to press down. In these vast, black spaces, the fragrant smoke had nowhere to escape. It collected in the still, cool air of the hypostyle halls, settling so thickly that a priest moving through it might briefly see his own breath stir the perfumed haze. The experience within the windowless inner sanctuaries would have been especially intense. Here, in the absolute darkness and silence broken only by the crackle of a single brazier, the scent of the night's incense would have been utterly overwhelming. It would coat the tongue, cling to the linen of the priest's robes, and fill his lungs with every breath, inducing a state of deep meditation or trance. This was no longer an aroma to be observed. It was an environment to be inhabited, a thick, palpable manifestation of the divine presence that was believed to be strongest and most accessible during the mysterious and dangerous hours of the night. This seamless blend of the spiritual and the medicinal was absolutely fundamental to the ancient Egyptian worldview. For the priests performing these rituals, there was no clear dividing line between a fragrance that pleased a god and one that healed a human body. They were two sides of the same sacred coin. The very same resins, oils, and unguents that were offered to the deities in lavish quantities were also meticulously documented in medical papyri as potent remedies for a vast array of ailments. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a deeply held belief that disease was often caused by invisible, malevolent forces or an imbalance in the body's channels, and that the correct aromatic substance could combat these issues on the physical and a spiritual level. Take frankincense, for example. While its smoke was seen as the celestial breath of Amun, its ground resin was also a staple in the Egyptian medical cabinet. The Ebers Papyrus, one of our most complete medical texts, prescribes a paste made from frankincense resin, honey, and barley beer to treat a persistent cough and soothe inflammation in the throat. The same bright, antiseptic quality that made its smoke seem purifying to the spirit also had a tangible, antimicrobial effect on infected tissue. Myrrh, Hathor's sacred scent, was even more versatile. Its deep, balsamic resin was ground into powders to dress wounds and stop bleeding, thanks to its potent astringent properties. It was mixed into wines to treat stomach pains and parasitic infections, and blended into oils to soothe aching muscles and arthritic joints. The priests understood that myrrh's ability to preserve, it was a key ingredient in mummification, could also be harnessed to protect the living from decay and infection. Perhaps the most fascinating intersection was the use of aromatics to treat what we might now consider mental or psychological states. The famous kyphi blend, the ultimate ritual incense, was also taken internally as a medicine. Plutarch, writing centuries later, noted that kyphi lulls one to sleep, allays anxieties, and brightens dreams. The Egyptians believed its complex mix of ingredients, including the psychoactive blue lotus, calming juniper berries, and uplifting raisins and wine, could literally alter one's state of consciousness. Inhaling its smoke during a temple ceremony wasn't just about sending prayers to the gods. It was a way to calm the mind of the worshiper, to ease their earthly worries, and to open them up to a more receptive, spiritual frame of mind. The line between a spiritual experience and a medically induced state of tranquility was beautifully, intentionally blurred. This belief in the protective power of scent extended to public health as well. During times of plague or pestilence, the scale of incense burning would have been increased dramatically. The priests would have swung their censers with even greater fervor, not just as a symbolic act to please angry gods, but in a very practical belief that the thick, antimicrobial smoke could literally cleanse the air of miasma, the harmful, invisible vapors they believed carry disease. While they didn't understand germ theory, their empirical observation likely told them that areas saturated with the smoke of certain resins seemed to have fewer outbreaks. The temple, therefore, functioned as a kind of massive, aromatic sanitizing station, its fragrant atmosphere serving as a protective bubble against the chaos of illness, demonstrating how the sacred and the practical were forever intertwined in the scented air of ancient Egypt. Today, that silent world is being brought back to life, not through imagination alone, but through a fascinating fusion of cutting-edge science and ancient artistry. Historians, archaeologists, and a new breed of experimental perfumers are embarking on an extraordinary mission to literally recreate the lost scents of ancient Egypt. Their primary target is the legendary kyphi, along with other sacred oils, using the very recipes preserved on temple walls and in medical papyri. This isn't just an academic exercise, it's a form of sensory archaeology, an attempt to use our noses as a time machine to experience a dimension of the past we thought was lost forever. The process begins with the same meticulous detective work we discussed earlier. Specialists in ancient texts, known as philologists, carefully translate the hieroglyphic recipes, facing immediate and complex challenges. A term like 10 deben of honey is straightforward, but what about an ingredient listed only as the fruit of the desert tree? Botanical identification becomes a critical puzzle. Does des refer to the juniper berry with its piney, citrusy aroma? Or is it the fruit of the pistacia tree, which offers a completely different, green, and riciny scent? Researchers cross-reference multiple sources, temple inscriptions, medical texts like the Ebers Papyrus, and even accounts from later Greek and Roman writers like Plutarch and Dioscorides to build a consensus on the most likely ingredient. This scholarly groundwork is the essential first step, turning a list of mysterious names into a potential shopping list for the modern world. Armed with this research, the next phase involves sourcing authentic materials. This is where the project transforms from theory into practice. Modern perfumers committed to historical accuracy will seek out resins harvested using traditional methods from the same regions the Egyptians used frankincense from Oman, myrrh from Somalia. They'll track down heritage varieties of grapes for the wine base, use raw, unfiltered honey, and find wild harvested juniper berries rather than cultivated ones. The goal is to replicate not just the chemical components, but the very quality and character of the raw materials an Egyptian priest would have had at his disposal. Every deviation, every substitution with a modern equivalent is a step away from the authentic experience. Then comes the alchemy itself, the actual blending. Following the ancient instructions is a lesson in patience and sensory awareness. The recipe from the Edfu temple, for instance, specifies that the raisins must be macerated in wine and left to ferment for days before any other ingredients are added. The resins must be pounded by hand in a stone mortar, not ground in an electric grinder, to achieve the correct texture and to avoid heating the aromatics, which would alter their chemical profile. The mixing order is precise and often ritualistic. As the modern practitioner combines the ingredients, they are not just making a perfume, they are performing a centuries-old ritual, their hands engaging in the same motions as a priest from Thebes or Memphis. The mixture is then left to mature, sometimes for weeks or months, allowing all the complex notes to meld and harmonize, just as the ancient texts describe. So what happens when a ball of this meticulously recreated kyphi is finally placed on a charcoal disc and allowed to smolder? The accounts from those who have experienced it are consistently awe-inspiring. The smoke is not sharp or acrid. It is incredibly rich, thick, and surprisingly gentle. The first impression is often a wave of deep, caramel-like sweetness from the honey and wine-soaked raisins, a comforting and almost gourmand note. This is quickly followed by the warm, spicy undertones of cinnamon and juniper, which provide a vibrant, energizing heart to the aroma. Finally, the profound, sacred bass notes of frankincense and myrrh emerge, grounding the entire experience with their balsamic, meditative depth. It's a scent that is at once familiar and utterly alien, unlike any modern incense or perfume. It has a weight and a complexity that is physically palpable, seeming to fill a room not just with smoke, but with a presence. These modern recreations have taught us something profound about the original temple experience, its intentional subtlety. We live in a world of overpowering synthetic fragrances designed for immediate impact. Kyphi is the absolute opposite. Its magic unfolds slowly, revealing its layers over time. This tells us that the ancient Egyptian olfactory environment was not about a quick, fragrant blast, but about a sustained, immersive atmospheric transformation. The goal was to create a scent so complex and enduring that it would become the very air one breathed for hours, altering consciousness through prolonged exposure rather than a single overwhelming moment. Perhaps the most significant revelation from these projects is the apparent psychoactive effect. Many modern experimenters report that breathing in the smoke of recreated kyphi induces a distinct state of calm tranquility, a slight euphoria, and a clarity of mind that is ideal for meditation or reflection. This lends powerful credence to the ancient claims that kyphi could allay anxieties and brighten dreams. When you combine the known mild psychoactive properties of blue lotus, the potential effects of fermented wine vapors, and the well-documented calming effects of certain terpenes found in frankincense and myrrh, the recipe begins to look less like a random mix of nice smells and more like a sophisticated pharmacological formula for altering mental state. The temple's scent wasn't just a background ambience, it was an active technology for bridging the gap between the human and the divine, a technology we are only just beginning to understand through the brave and curious work of these modern olfactory explorers. So as we've journeyed through these halls together, it becomes clear that an Egyptian temple was so much more than a visual marvel of carved stone and towering columns. It was a masterfully engineered spiritual experience, a multi-sensory universe where every single aroma was meticulously chosen, blended, and released with profound intention. The air itself was a sacred text, written in molecules of resin, flour, and spice, telling a story of divine connection that engaged the body just as deeply as the mind. From the overwhelming clouds of frankincense and myrrh that announced a god's presence to the hypnotic sweetness of the blue lotus that opened the doors of perception. Sand was the invisible architecture of faith, as vital to worship as any statue or hymn. This challenges our modern, overwhelmingly visual relationship with history. We stand in museums before a silent, scentless statue of a pharaoh or a sealed alabaster jar, and we see only the object. But now we know that these artifacts were once part of a living, breathing, fragrant reality. The jar held oil that made a priest smell divine. The statue was anointed with perfumes that define its very identity. The next time you encounter an image of an Egyptian temple or a relic in a display case, I invite you to go beyond what your eyes can show you, close them for a moment. Try to summon the memory of a scent, the clean, sharp smell of pine needles, the rich warmth of cinnamon, the calming sweetness of honey. Now build upon that. Imagine those familiar notes woven into something far more complex and ancient, the thick, smoky balsamic cloud of kyphi, the narcotic blossom of thousands of lotuses, the crisp mineral breath of sun-warmed limestone. In doing so, you aren't just imagining a smell, you are reclaiming a vital dimension of the human experience, one that the ancient Egyptians understood was fundamental to touching the divine. You are breathing life back into the stone and completing a picture that has been incomplete for millennia. You are, for just a moment, stepping across the threshold of time, not as a distant observer, but as a participant, finally able to breathe in the lost sacred air of ancient Egypt.